I am very glad to hear UK officials saying that they will abide by the convention that they have signed. They clearly believe that these cluster munitions are too dangerous to be used on any battlefield. And I think, one of our concerns is that after Ukraine, does this decision by the U.S. to transfer cluster munitions actually open up a new front in any conflict where now these cluster munitions are going to be considered normal? And I hope that the UK and other European allies will put their foot down and say, no, absolutely not. We believe that these are too dangerous.
The United States is facing a backlash from human rights groups over its decision to supply cluster bombs to Ukraine. More than 120 countries, including the UK, have signed up to an international treaty which bans the use or production of the weapons. This was the Prime Minister's response when he was asked today about the US decision.
UK is signatory to a convention which prohibits the production or use of cluster munitions and discourages their use. We will continue to do our part to support Ukraine against Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion. We've done that by providing heavy battle tanks and most recently long-range weapons, and hopefully all countries can continue to support Ukraine. Russia's act of barbarism is causing untold suffering to millions of people. It's right that we collectively stand up to it, and I'll be heading off to the NATO summit next week in Vilnius, where we will be discussing exactly this with our allies, how we can strengthen our support for Ukraine.
Well, cluster munitions explode in the air and disperse small bomblets, but some fail to explode and can remain a hazard for civilians for years afterwards. The US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan defended what he said was a difficult decision.
So the bottom line is this. We recognize that cluster munitions create a risk of civilian harm from unexploded ordnance. This is why we've deferred the decision for as long as we could. But there is also a massive risk of civilian harm if Russian troops and tanks roll over Ukrainian positions and take more Ukrainian territory and subjugate more Ukrainian civilians because Ukraine does not have enough artillery. That is intolerable to us.
And the Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik said the US cluster bombs are the safest ones available.
The cluster munitions that Russians are using against us have the unexplosiveness rate as 40%. So basically like around a half, right? And the ones that we requested from the United States have the unexplosives rate less than 2%. And they have proven to be very effective and something that our military commanders requested.
Well, Sarah Yager is Washington Director of Human Rights Watch, and she joins me now. Good afternoon to you, Sarah.
Good afternoon.
Good to speak to you. What do you make of this decision by the US government?
We're deeply disappointed in this decision. We knew it was coming for some time, but look, there are two big problems with this. First is the humanitarian issue that this causes. There is no way to make cluster munitions harmless. And second, over half of the world's countries, as you mentioned, have signed a convention banning these weapons because they are so dangerous on the battlefield to civilians. And so President Biden is really breaking with an international norm here.
But as we heard from Kira Rudik, who's a Ukrainian MP, these US ones have a much lower rate of the bomblets that fail to explode, which are the sorts of munitions that then lie around and can be hazardous to civilians in months and years to come. And as we heard from the United States, from Jake Sullivan, I mean, the Russians are using these weapons anyway.
So when I hear the argument that the Russians are using them anyway, it sounds to me like a race to the bottom, and that is deeply concerning, especially for two countries, Ukraine and the United States, that believe in international law and humanity, even in times of the worst wars. The dud rates are all over the place. So Ukraine is saying the dud rate is less than 2%. The Pentagon is saying 2.35. We've heard 1%. Our data, Human Rights Watch has looked into this data from the Pentagon, actually says 14%. So it's very unclear. The Pentagon has not made the data available. They say that it is classified. And look, regardless of what the dud rate is, it is never going to be zero.
So your concerns are about the potential danger in future if these weapons are used by the Ukrainians, that there could still be unexploded ordnance left for the future?
There absolutely will be in the future, but we also published earlier this week a report that showed that Ukrainian cluster munitions that they received, we think from Turkey, have already killed Ukrainian civilians. So this is not something just about the future. It is not just about when the conflict ends. Rather, we already have evidence that these cluster munitions are causing civilian deaths and injuries.
So you are saying that you've already seen evidence that Ukraine has used cluster munitions already in this war with Russia?
Yes, we have found evidence of that in Izium, which was a Russian-occupied area. We went in there. We were not looking for evidence of cluster munitions. We found it, though, and we are very confident that they came from the Ukrainians.
And what do you think was the effect of that weapon there in Izium?
Well, there were civilian deaths, civilian injuries, absolutely. There are likely still duds remaining across the Izium landscape, and that's what we expect to see in the future, both currently when the U.S. weapons are delivered and, of course, when the conflict is over and all of these need to be cleaned up.
Ukraine is clearly planning, though, to use these cluster bombs in areas, particularly along that eastern front, where you have got Russian forces dug in, where it is very difficult indeed for the Ukrainian troops to make progress. And these are areas where there are, frankly, no civilians left there, and where much of the civilian infrastructure has already been destroyed. I mean, do you understand why Ukraine thinks that these cluster bombs could be significant in enabling Ukraine to regain more of its territory?
I could see how Ukraine believes that any artillery that is delivered to them could be significant in the war with Russia. I think, they're not going to be using these in open fields. And the question is, if they were, then why have they already used cluster munitions in areas that are filled with civilians and have already caused civilian deaths and injuries? Ukraine is not an unpopulated place. There are civilians everywhere. So I understand their intentions, and U.S. and Ukrainian policymakers are clearly not intending to harm civilians, as Russia is. So it's a very different prospect. However, again, these cluster munitions cannot be made harmless. And I do think that as the war goes on, we're going to see Ukrainians, civilians killed and injured again by them.
What do you think should be the response of countries like the UK, which is a close ally of the United States? Rishi Sunak's meeting Joe Biden this week. They are also both, of course, important NATO allies. And the UK is a signatory to this international treaty which bans the use of cluster bombs.
I am very glad to hear UK officials saying that they will abide by the convention that they have signed. They clearly believe that these cluster munitions are too dangerous to be used on any battlefield. And I think, one of our concerns is that after Ukraine, does this decision by the U.S. to transfer cluster munitions actually open up a new front in any conflict where now these cluster munitions are going to be considered normal? And I hope that the UK and other European allies will put their foot down and say, no, absolutely not. We believe that these are too dangerous.
Why do you think that the United States has done this? It must have known that there would be a reaction from organisations like yours and indeed from some of its allies. I mean, it does seem as though it is a case of the US having plenty of supplies of these bombs, knowing what a difference they can make and deciding that strategically it was the right thing to do.
Well, what you said, those reasons, is exactly what we heard from the State Department, the White House, and the Pentagon yesterday when they were offering their briefings. And they went into great detail about their rationale, I think because they understand that there's going to be this big backlash. I can't speak to exactly why they thought that this was the most important. And I also really question the military utility of it. We've heard a lot of, these are 4 times more effective than other ammunition. I don't know. Again, we haven't seen the data. The Pentagon has not been forthcoming with that.
Sarah Yager, Washington Director of Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.